Kyle Mohan Racing, KMR. We're setting up rotors for Mazda tricks. This happens to be a 3-rotor, but I thought this was a great opportunity to talk about the oil control springs and oil control rings that are inside of the rotor assembly. I think a lot of people may not even realize this, as the paint is often not there if you're dealing with used parts, but the control ring springs are actually directional and very specific in their rotor placement. And you can actually see that the little round tab, let me grab one of these, is locking in to that little indentation down there in the oil control ring groove inside the rotor. And if you happen to put the wrong spring in the wrong groove, under rotation it will not lock, and then your oil control ring will not lock on the opposing side on that tab, and then you will get excessive wear. And that can cause premature failure to the oil control rings and other areas of the rotary motor. So my trick of the day is I like to lay out my rotors directionally, so when I'm assembling them, it's less likely that I will do it wrong, and it's a pattern that I would recommend for success. If you think about it, this is a 3-rotor, so you have a front, center, and rear, which actually means you're setting up 2 fronts and a rear. Or if you have a 13B, you're just dealing with a front and a rear. So I'll lay both of them out with the rear side of the rotor facing up. So this is going to be my front rotor for the moment. And if you think about it, the gear side is down, and that's the side that's running against the end plate, which would be the front of the motor. So thereby, the non-gear side of your front rotor is the back side. And for color coding purposes, the blue spring goes to the rear of the rotor. Hence, on my rear rotor, the gear side is up against the rear gear. They're opposing each other. So the blue springs will go to the gear side of the rear rotor. And if you're dealing with multi-rotors, 3 rotors, 4 rotors, you're continuing that pattern like I was just talking about. In our case, these would be essentially a front center, but they're both being set up as rotationally, directionally cued gear to the front. And then obviously the other spring, if it's OEM and non-racing spec, these are just the normal OEM springs, then the front spring would be color-coded white. So white to the front of the rotor and blue to the back. And like I was mentioning, if you look at your oil control rings, they also have an indentation which is locking into that spring. I use OEM O-rings on almost all of my builds. I've never had an OEM oil control ring fail for any reason. New oil control rings from Mazda Tricks. Lightly lube them. Too much oil and you can hydraulically have the ring not set and push itself back out, and not enough oil or lube, depending on your preference. The O-ring can actually be damaged on installation. So for video purposes here, I'm going to see if I can do this one-handed. But essentially, you can see we have the spring in location with the round point down and the square point up. And we're looking at what would be the back side of this rotor, because it is a front rotor. And so this would be the back side, non-gear side. And you'll actually take your oil control ring, make sure you get it lined up with those tabs, and drop it down in. It's hard for me to do one-handed. Let's see if I can do this here. All right. Oop, get the camera. We're lining up. And we're bringing it down on. I'm not going to do the full installation, but you shouldn't have to force this too hard down in. Always keep it square. You don't want to force one side before the other. That can lead to damaging the oil control ring, twisting it, pinching the O-ring. Generally, you can see, too, as you're installing, if the O-ring is good or bad. And once you're installed, you should have nice movement up and down. Just some KMR tips setting these rotors up, and I thought to myself, I get asked these questions. What side of the rotor does the oil control spring go on? Does it matter? How can you tell if they're used? All of these things come up, and essentially it's all a rotational cue. They need to line up with their indentations, blue to the back, white to the front. And if you don't have any color coding on your rotors, you can hop online. There's enough information out there to generally be able to match stuff up, or find somebody that does have a brand new oil control ring so you can match up which way they're directionally going. So there we can see our oil control rings are set in. They're not sticking up. They're not drooping to one side. No O-rings are pinched, and we're locked into our springs. So now that we have our rotors flipped over, you can see that we have our white coated oil control ring springs in there. So now you're looking at what would be the front side of the front rotor and the front side of the rear rotor. Confusing myself. And in a 3-rotor, you've got the 2 gear sides pointing forward. That's just how it works. So you can see again, the round tab is what's locking into the rotor, and the square tab pointing up is what will lock into the oil control ring. And again, this is stopping the oil control ring from spinning on itself inside the rotor, which leads to premature failure. The oil control ring springs are what actually help hold the oil control ring in its place, and then the O-rings are sealing up against the rib, preventing the oil that's inside the rotor, which is your cooling of the rotor, from spilling into the combustion area. Sometimes you'll see old rotary motors that smoke on startup, and a lot of the times that has to do with either worn out oil control rings, O-rings that have gotten hard over too many heat cycles, getting excessively hot, and just things that would cause a little bit of that oil that's trapped inside the rotor once you turn a car off to leak down a little bit into the combustion chamber. And then you start it up, you get a little oil smoke. Or if you're smoking a lot while you're running and it's not some type of external failure, then again, I would be looking towards the O-rings, the oil control ring wear, or maybe something in the spring area that's failed. Mazda Tricks did the lightning side cutting. This is full balanced assembly. It's really a nice setup, polished. All right, now you can see again. We're just going to be lining up the square notch in the oil control ring with the square tab on the spring. Definitely don't twist these when you lay them in. You want them to lay in nice and flat. Always make sure your O-ring is looking good, and then push it down square. I have to do it with 2 hands, so I can't do it on the camera right now. Some people will use a board or something, but I don't like adding any extra pressure to any of the side seals, so then it can change the way you assemble stuff. And I don't like doing side seals with an oily rotor. So my preference is doing it by hand, 2 hands keeping it square. And I do all my side seals with a dry rotor. And then this is the final stages of assembly for a rotor, which is dropping the oil control rings in. Yeah, there you go. I keep saying it, but yeah, leave comments. Any questions, let us know. And I just thought it was a good opportunity to give some tips on the oil control ring setup. 3-rotor, 13B, 4-rotor. It's all the same idea.